Okay, today we are gonna learn something about the arterial supply of your body. Okay, the arterial supply. The main arterial supply of your body is derived from your aorta, and the aorta is derived from your left ventricle. Okay, now the part of the aorta which arises from the left ventricle, the root part, is called the root of the aorta. Okay, now after the root, the aorta ascends up like this as a straight pipe. This part of the aorta is called the ascending aorta. The part which is arising just from the left ventricle is the root of aorta, and the part which ascends from the root is called the ascending part of the aorta or ascending aorta. Now, at the angle of Lewis means the angle between the manubrium sternum and the body of the sternum. Okay. Now, at the angle of Lewis, the ascending aorta curves like this to form the arch of aorta. Okay. Now at this angle of Lewis, at the same angle of Lewis, the arch of aorta straightens downward. Okay. Now the straightened part of the arch of aorta in the thorax region is called the thoracic aorta. Okay. So the arch of aorta is from the angle of Lewis to the angle of Lewis. Means the ascending aorta turns into the arch of aorta at the angle of Lewis, and the arch of aorta converts into the thoracic aorta at the same angle of Lewis. Clear? Now the thoracic aorta descends downward as a straight pipe. Okay. Now this thoracic aorta pierces the diaphragm at the level of T12 vertebra or thoracic 12th vertebra posteriorly. Okay. Now this thoracic part of the aorta, when it pierces the diaphragm at the T12 vertebra level, the part which pierces the diaphragm is now present in the abdominal region. Okay. Now the aorta is present in abdominal region, and this part of the aorta which is present in abdominal region is called the abdominal aorta. Clear? Now the abdominal aorta now descends downward as a straight pipe like the thoracic aorta, and it descends up to the L5 vertebra, lower border of L4 and upper border of L5. What happens at L5 vertebra is the abdominal aorta bifurcates into two terminal branches, the common iliac arteries, the left and the right common iliac arteries. So the abdominal aorta terminates into two common iliac arteries. Now look at L4, L5 level. Now the common iliac arteries on each side goes downward like this, again divides into two arteries. One is present externally, or one goes externally, and one turns inward to supply the visceral organ in the pelvic region. The one which turns inward is called the internal iliac artery, and the branch of common iliac which goes outward is called the external iliac artery. Clear? Now the external iliac artery, when crosses the inguinal ligament, the inguinal ligament is the ligament from anterosuperior spine to your pubic symphysis. When the same external iliac artery crosses the inguinal ligament, the artery is called the femoral artery. The same artery, just the name changes. Clear? Now the femoral artery descends downward. Okay. Now this femoral artery turns backward and goes back up the knee region called the popliteal region, and the same femoral artery is now called the popliteal artery. Now this popliteal artery divides into two arteries in the leg region. The one which goes anterior to the leg region is called anterior tibial artery, and the one which goes posteriorly in the leg region is called the posterior tibial artery. Clear? Now look, the posterior tibial artery again divides into two branches. Actually, the posterior tibial artery goes straight downward, and it gives a branch laterally. Okay, the laterally present bone is your fibula, and the fibular region is also called the peroneal region. That's why the branch of the posterior tibial artery which goes laterally is called the peroneal artery. Okay, common peroneal artery. And the posterior tibial artery, it descends as such as the continuation downward. Okay, in the sole region, the posterior tibial artery divides into two terminal branches. The sole region is called the plantar region. One terminal branch goes laterally, another one goes medially, and these two branches are called medial and lateral plantar artery, forming medial and lateral plantar arches. Clear? Now look, the anterior tibial artery, the another terminal branch of the popliteal artery, goes downward as such. When the same anterior tibial artery crosses the medial malleolus, it is called the dorsalis pedis artery, and this one goes anteriorly to supply the first intermetatarsal cleft. Clear? Okay, now this is the overall brief stem of the aorta. This is the overall brief stem of the aorta. Now have a look at the branches of the aorta, main branches. I'll tell you the main branches of the aorta. Okay, now look, I told you the first part of the aorta, which arises just from the left ventricle, is called the root of the aorta. Okay, from the root of the aorta, there arises the arteries which supply the heart itself. These are the coronary arteries. So the left and the right coronary arteries arise from the root of the aorta. Clear? Now, the aorta after the root ascends upward as the ascending aorta. There is no branch from the ascending aorta. Now the arch of aorta comes. Okay, now there are three major branches from the arch of aorta. One, I am telling you from the left to right. I am telling you the branches from the left to right. The leftmost branch is the left subclavian artery, and the left subclavian artery supplies the upper limb region. Subclavian artery always supply the upper limb region. Okay, so the first branch from left to right is the left subclavian artery for the upper limb region. Next comes the left common carotid artery. Left common carotid artery is for the left side of your head and neck and your internal organs of your head and neck. Clear? Now comes a single artery for both your hand, upper limb, and your right side of your head and neck region. This artery supplies the upper limb or brachial region and also the head and neck or cephalic region. That's why this artery is called the right brachiocephalic artery. Actually, there is only one brachiocephalic artery. Again, this brachiocephalic artery divides into right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. Clear? This artery divides into right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. Now, subclavian artery goes towards the upper limb region. When the same subclavian artery crosses the outer border of your first rib, when the subclavian artery crosses the outer border of your first rib, the same subclavian artery is called your axillary artery. Clear? The same subclavian artery is called axillary artery. Now your axillary artery goes towards your axillary region. Now the same artery which was your subclavian artery after crossing the first rib, it is called the axillary artery. Now this artery is running like this. Now this axillary artery, when crosses the outer border of your teres major muscle, the same artery is called your brachial artery, because now the same artery is present in the brachial region. Clear? Now the brachial artery is present in upper limb. Now the brachial artery at the cubital fossa, the brachial artery at the cubital fossa divides into two terminal branches. The one which goes laterally is called the radial artery, whereas the one which goes medially is called the ulnar artery. Clear? Now look, the radial artery goes like this and ulnar artery goes like this. Okay. Now the ulnar artery is mainly present in the palmar region. This is your hand region. This portion of your hand is called the palmar region. This is called the dorsum of your hand. So the ulnar artery is mainly present in your palmar region, and the radial artery mainly goes deep and goes to lie in the dorsum of your hand. Okay. Now the ulnar artery is present in your palmar region. It curves to form an arc-like structure, but it cannot complete the whole arch. The radial artery again goes deep to form a arc-like structure in the dorsum of your hand, but it also cannot form a complete arch. The radial artery gives a superficial branch of the radial artery which goes superficially to complete the arch formed by the ulnar artery. And this arch is called the palmar arch. Whereas the ulnar artery, which is present in the superficial region, gives a deep branch which goes like this and completes the arch formed by the radial artery. And this arch is called the dorsal arch, dorsal arterial arch. Clear? Now have a look at the branches of these arteries. Now look. The subclavian artery is from the origin to the outer border of your first rib. Now this portion of the subclavian artery is again divided into three parts with respect to a muscle called scalenus anterior. Okay. Now this scalenus anterior runs over the subclavian artery and divides the subclavian artery into three parts. The one which is present medial to the scalenus anterior is called the first part. The one which lies just behind the scalenus anterior is called the second part, and the part of the subclavian artery which lies lateral to the scalenus anterior muscle is called the third part. Now, the first part of the subclavian artery gives three branches. The first one is the vertebral artery. Second one is the internothoracic artery, and the third one is the thyrocervical trunk. Okay. Now the second part, which lies just behind the scalenus anterior muscle, gives a single branch called the costocervical trunk, and the third part gives only a single branch called the dorsal scapular artery. Clear? So these branches of the subclavian artery can be remembered by mnemonic vitamin C and D. The VIT part of the vitamin C and D is the branches of the first part of the subclavian artery, whereas the C part, vitamin C part, gives the second part branch of subclavian artery, whereas the D part denotes the third part branch of the subclavian artery. Okay, the vertebral artery, internothoracic artery, thyrocervical trunk, costocervical trunk, and the dorsal scapular artery are the branches of the subclavian artery. Again, after crossing the first rib, outer border of the first rib, the same subclavian artery is converted into axillary artery. Now, the axillary artery is again divided into three branches by a muscle called the pectoralis minor. Okay. Now, like the scalenus anterior, the pectoralis minor muscle is also present upon the axillary artery and divides the axillary artery into three equal divisions. The part which is present medially is the first part. The part which is present posterior to the pectoralis major muscle is the second part, and the part which lies lateral to the pectoralis major muscle is the third part of your axillary artery. Now, the first part of the axillary artery gives a single branch called the superior thoracic artery. The second part gives the lateral thoracic artery and the thoracoacromial artery. Okay, so the first part gives the superior thoracic artery, the second part gives the lateral thoracic and the thoracoacromial artery, and the third part gives three branches. The one which is present in dorsal region of the thorax is called the thoracodorsal artery, and another two branches circumflex or rounds the humeral head called the anterior and the posterior circumflex humeral artery. So the axillary artery three part gives six branches. The first part gives the one branch, second part gives two branch, and third part gives three branch. 1, 2, 3. Clear? Now again, the common carotid artery divides into two branches. The one which goes externally to supply the external surface of your head and neck region is called the external carotid artery, and the one which goes internally and the internal carotid canal and opens into the lacerum, foramen of lacerum, okay, and goes inside the skull to supply the brain matter. This branch is called the internal carotid artery. Okay, so the common carotid artery at C4 level divides into external and internal carotid artery. Now your external carotid artery has 8 branches. The first branch is your superior thyroid artery, and the two terminal branches are your superficial temporal and the maxillary artery. And another branches are the ascending palatine artery, lingual artery, facial artery, and your posterior auricular and occipital arteries. Okay. Now these are the 8 branches of external carotid artery. Now the internal carotid artery goes into the skull and supply the brain matter. Okay. Now there are several branches of the internal carotid artery, but the main branches which supply the brain is the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Okay. Now look, I told you there's a branch of the subclavian artery called the vertebral artery. Okay. Now this vertebral artery ascends up in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra. The cervical vertebra has a transverse process, and that transverse process has some openings, single openings, and within these openings the vertebral artery ascends. Look, the 7th cervical vertebra has a opening in the transverse process. Okay, but that opening does not permit the vertebral artery to run through it. Okay, so vertebral artery passes through the openings of the transverse process of cervical vertebra from C1 to C6. Okay, now it ascends up like this, and it goes in the foramen of magnum and goes inside the skull. Okay, now both the vertebral artery at the base of the skull combine to form a single artery, and these arteries combine to form a single artery in the base of the brain, and that's why this single artery is called the basilar artery. Okay, now look, this basilar artery again divides into 2 terminal branches. These 2 terminal branches of the basilar artery is called the posterior cerebral artery. Look, I told you the anterior and middle cerebral artery are the branches of the internal carotid artery, but the posterior cerebral artery is a branch of the basilar artery, terminal branch of the basilar artery. Now the anterior cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery, and a branch from the internal carotid artery directly, which connects the internal carotid artery to the posterior cerebral artery, called the posterior communicating artery, along with the anterior communicating artery. These arteries simultaneously form a circle-like structure at the base of the brain called the circle of Willis, which supply the base of the brain. The whole cerebrum and the cerebral cortex area, they are supplied by your cerebral arteries, the anterior, middle, and the posterior cerebral arteries. Base of the brain along with the brainstem area is supplied by the circle of Willis. Clear? Now look, the thoracic aorta descends downward like this. Thoracic aorta gives several branches, and these branches are mainly divided into the parietal and visceral branches. Now the thoracic aorta pierces the diaphragm at T12 level, okay, and comes into the abdominal region. Now in the abdominal region, the part of the aorta up to the L5 vertebra, T12 to L5 vertebra, is called the abdominal aorta. After L5 vertebra, it divides or terminates into 2 terminal branches, the common iliac arteries. Clear? Now, this abdominal aorta gives 10 branches. Look, the abdominal aorta gives 3 anterior branches, anterior main 3 branches. The one which arises just after piercing the diaphragm at T12 level itself is called the celiac artery. The one which arises just below the celiac trunk origin is called the superior mesenteric artery, and this one arises at L1 level. Okay, now another branch which also arises from the anterior portion of the abdominal aorta at L3 level is the inferior mesenteric artery. So there are 3 anterior branches of the abdominal aorta: the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, and the inferior mesenteric artery. The celiac trunk arises at T12 level, whereas the superior mesenteric artery at L1 and the inferior mesenteric artery arises at L3 level. Clear? Now, there are two posterior branches. The one which arises posteriorly and supplies the vertebra present posterior to the aorta, the lumbar vertebra mainly. These are the lumbar arteries. There are four lumbar arteries in L1 to L4 level. Clear? So the first posterior branch category is your lumbar arteries. Another posterior branch of the abdominal aorta is the median sacral artery. This median sacral artery arises just before the termination of the aorta. Clear? So there are two posterior branches. One is the lumbar arteries, another one is the median sacral arteries. Clear? Now there are four lateral branches. The superior most branch goes upward and supplies the inferior surface of the diaphragm. Okay, now this superior most branch is called the inferior phrenic artery. Next arises a branch which supplies a gland-like structure just above the kidney, the suprarenal gland, also called the adrenal gland. And this branch is the middle suprarenal artery. Okay. Next arises a branch of aorta laterally which goes directly to your kidney called the renal artery. And the last lateral branch which goes downward in the pelvic region to the respective gonads. In the male, the testicular artery, and the female, the ovarian artery. So, laterally arising four arteries: inferior phrenic, middle suprarenal, renal, and the gonadal artery. In male it's called the testicular artery, in female it's called the ovarian artery. Okay, and the terminal branches are the common iliac artery. So we are done with the 10 branches, main branches of the abdominal aorta. Anteriorly, celiac trunk, superior and inferior mesenteric artery. Laterally, inferior phrenic, middle suprarenal, renal, and the gonadal arteries. Posteriorly, the lumbar arteries and median sacral artery. Clear? Now look, embryologically, a whole gut is divided into three divisions. The part which is developed towards your cephalic region is called the foregut, and this foregut extends up to your part of the duodenum where the major duodenal papilla is present. And where is the major duodenal papilla present? The major duodenal papilla is the portion of the duodenum where the biliary and the pancreatic duct combinedly open into the duodenum. Okay, up to this portion, the part of the gut is called the foregut or proximal gut. Okay, now from the major duodenal papilla of the duodenum up to the right 2/3 of the transverse colon is called the midgut, and from the right 2/3 of the transverse colon to the rectum part is called the hindgut or distal gut. So the foregut includes the esophagus, stomach, and the part of duodenum which is present proximal to the major duodenal papilla. The midgut includes the duodenum which is present distal to major duodenal papilla, the jejunum ileum, cecum appendix, ascending colon, and the transverse colon up to the right 2/3. And the hindgut includes the transverse colon from the division of right 2/3 and left 1/3 to the rectum region. Clear?